Welcome to our last lecture of the semester. We're looking at the Arctic region as a case study to figure out how the key concepts we looked at in the first half of the semester, so power, alliances, international law, organization, intervention, how they could help us understand specific cases. In this case, the Arctic region. And the question that will occupy our mind here is how can they explain the lack of conflict in the Arctic region? Okay? And some of the risks. There are some risks. There are some threats to the security of that region. So we're going to try to make sense of how those key concepts can make us understand the absence of violent conflict in the region. To put us in context, here is the Arctic region, often mistaken for Antarctica, which is the South Pole. Now, in the Arctic region, of course, we're interested with the North Pole. You have a map of what we call the Arctic projection map, basically a map that has for center the North Pole, the center of the Arctic Ocean. That's the Arctic region, basically, and when we look at it this way, it seems like a big lake, frozen lake, is melting, of course, we'll get to that, surrounded by coastal states, surrounded by coastal lines. Canada, mostly Russia, but also Scandinavian countries, Greenland, and the US with Alaska. It's important to note here, I put this map to emphasize that this is a region sparsely populated. You don't have a lot of people living in that area north of 60, as we often say in Canada, north of the 60th parallel, which is the line separating provinces from territories in the west. So sparsely populated, industrial development is really low as well in most of the Arctic region. You also, by looking at this map, can make the assessment that the North American Arctic, the Arctic where we see Canada, Greenland, Nunavut, the Northwest Territory, and Yukon are experiencing very low development. Very poor infrastructure as well. There's not a lot of infrastructure installation there of quality or of number. There's just nothing there to speak of. Alaska is a bit better, but most of the infrastructure, ports, roads, icebreakers, are mostly present in what we call the European or the Russian Arctic. So in northwest Russia, okay, where you see, for example, Murmansk, that's where you find a lot of industrial development and key infrastructure like ports, roads, and vessels that can navigate these waters. It's also in the European Arctic, so northern Norway, northern Finland, northern Sweden, that you find kind of quality infrastructure of that nature that you don't find really in northern Canada. Even US, Alaska is mostly on the southern part of Alaska that you find quality infrastructure. In the north, it's a bit lower quality, and they have a bit less of those. So just a general snapshot of the region that will be at the center of our interest here. For the longest time, that region has been the center of military attention. So if you look at geopolitical history, the Arctic region has mostly been thought of during the Cold War, from 1945 to 1991, as a military space, as a space that we need to defend. For example, in Canada's Arctic, that we need to defend against possible Soviet invader, possible Russian invaders. Okay, same thing if you look in Iceland and Greenland. Mostly those places had US military bases on them. The region was mostly thought of as a military space where we deployed radar. The black line you see there, every single dot or points there is a huge radar station. Mostly a region where we can detect Russian invaders and kind of intercept them, kind of shoot them down before they get to the developed part of our countries, the southern part, Toronto, Ottawa, Calgary, the kind of urban centers. So it was very much represented as a space where we could have military conflicts, so we need to have military hardware present there. Very limited understanding of what the region could be or the potential it had. A glimmer of hope, though. In the late 1980s, for the first time, the Arctic is presented as a potential site of cooperation. In Mikhail Gorbachev, which was the USSR leader at the time, Murmansk speech, the Soviet leader present the region as a possible region for cooperation, as a region where USSR and capitalist countries could cooperate very pragmatically on issues of common interest. So basically, in this Murmansk speech, Gorbachev is appealing to possible cooperation with the West, which at the time was an incredible precedent. Okay? And that's the first glimmer of hope to get out of this way of just looking at it from a military confrontation or competition viewpoint. And it's really spurred subsequent development in the Arctic region. The development of multilateral organizations, for example, was called the ECS, the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. From 1991 to 96, Arctic states agreed to pool their scientific data together. Doesn't seem like much. It's very low-key, what we call low politics. We're not dealing with high geopolitical issues here. But just that Arctic states can share scientific studies they had and data they had on their part of the Arctic to have a common understanding of the Arctic ecosystem, of that very distinct environment, okay, from more a biological an ecosystem point of view. And that's the first embryo of cooperation in the region that will lead us to a formal institution, the Arctic Council, officialized in 1996. And after 2 years of very arduous negotiations, where basically, so we'll come to the states, there's 8 Arctic states, Canada, US because of Alaska, Russia, Iceland, and the Scandinavian countries. You have Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden. All of those came together because there was a strong desire to push that limited cooperation, the AEPS, forward, to get into something more ambitious, okay, where cooperation could thrive a bit more. So they state negotiated. The central question was, do we build an international organization, a regional organization that will be strong and have capabilities and capacities, or do we just build a weak council and there's not a lot of desire to push this forward and we don't want this council to be too powerful or to be too influential? The answer was a weak one. Arctic states didn't all agree to put in place a strong council with, for example, a charter. So the Arctic Council doesn't have a charter. Usually, an international organization that has a charter also at least have common principles, guiding principles that they follow. The Council has no such charter. Second, it took years. It took more than 15 years for the Council to have a permanent secretariat. So for 15 years, there was not even a common place where the Arctic Council was located. So the secretariat or the headquarters basically changed location every 2 years, okay, depending on which Arctic state had the chairmanship or the organization. So again, not an indicator of a strong organization by far. No stable funding even. States didn't agree to give a certain amount of money, a permanent budget to the organization. So the organization is still dependent on funding that is given on a punctual basis. Whenever states feel like it or feel that projects are compelling enough, they will fund them. Again, not very good for an international organization. You want a permanent budget, right? To plan ahead, years ahead often. Long-term project. And the organization only focus on issues of what we call low politics. So no military issues talked at the Arctic Council. No geopolitical or issues that are too political. Only social policies, social issues like health or education can be addressed at the council, or environmental protection issues. Those are often considered kind of low politics. We don't address the kind of overarching military or geopolitical concerns at the council. So all of this making for a very weak council, because one of the countries, you have the list there of 8 Arctic member states, 8 Arctic countries at the Arctic Council. The US basically was the one slamming on the brakes, was the one saying they didn't want a strong council. They didn't want a regional council that was too ambitious, that had too much power. So they always kind of really reluctant to support it. So they support a watered down version of the council that we ended up having, because all other states thought, well, it's the US, let's compromise. We better like to have a council with the US, even if it's weaker, even if it doesn't have a lot of power, than no council at all. So they wanted the council to have the US, great superpower at the time, on board, even if it's with a weak council like we saw. However, other states like the US compromise on other facets. If you can click on the embedded link, at the Arctic Council, there are also an original category they came up with. They call permanent participants. There's 6 permanent participants. Those participants are groups representing indigenous people living in the Arctic region. One of them, for example, is the Inuit Circumpolar Council. So an organization representing all Inuit people, which are indigenous people, living in the Arctic region. They have a seat there. Permanent participants are not members, so they don't have a right to vote. So they cannot vote on matters presented at the Arctic Council, but they have a say. They're always there, and often what kind of developed as common practice was that they are always consulted if Arctic Council projects will impact them. Okay, so states have built kind of an understanding that we need to ask participants, we need to get them involved, okay, for them to be active in the whole process. There are also observers, like in any other international organizations. In this one, however, the list is pretty extensive. You can click on the embedded link again. You have states like China, Singapore, South Korea, Poland. Seems weird, Poland as an observer on the Arctic region. They are there to observe, however. We need to kind of put that in context. Those states, observers are there to observe. They don't have a voting right. Their opinions don't necessarily need to be accounted for like permanent participants, right? They're just there to take notes and contribute sometimes if they want, and observe the deliberation, observe negotiations that are going on. This is the kind of picture we had in the early 2000s of what the Arctic region was about. Very pragmatic cooperation, focusing on kind of low-level issues, environmental and social, and a weak Arctic Council that didn't have really the capacity or the means to be ambitious. And then probably the issue that will be a game changer to all of this, the Arctic region was mostly defined as a frozen region, and not kind of in a metaphorical kind of way. There was, in many parts of the Arctic, a permanent ice cover. So there was ice permanently, year-long, and often multi-year, very thick there. Of course, the game changer for the region, and what really threw away this kind of calm regional construction of the Arctic Council, doing his little thing, working on environment and social, will be global warming. Global warming, of course, in the Arctic region will see that ice cover melt. What's the consequence of a melting ice cover? The region will be more accessible for various human activities. Okay, so the region will be more open and accessible, and it's often presented as a new region, right? The new El Dorado. We're going to put a lot of, we're going to put that in context to make sure it's really not what it's at stake here, but it's the perception that a new region is opening up. Okay, so our main question will be, do we face a scramble to the pole? Can we see a potential scramble to the Arctic region? And the notion of scramble meaning, are states kind of going very quickly in type of a race to get to the Arctic region. A race to do what? Well, to do a struggle, to kind of get, okay, to get ownership of part of that region. The other notion that we often hear is the idea that a struggle to the pole, that states are scrambling to get into this newly accessible region, and there will be a competition. There will be a power struggle between states to grab precious resources, to control precious shipping routes opening, or literally to claim parts of lands that are not theirs, right? That they're going to grab. There's going to be a land grab of some considered like, oh, will it be a new scramble to Africa of the 19th century, what we're going to see in this region. So for our purpose, we're going to assess if those two narratives are correct. And we're going to look at it from four perspectives that are often raised when we talk of a scramble or a struggle to the pole. We're going to look at natural resources, borders, shipping lanes, and governance. In our second video, we're going to focus on borders and shipping lanes.